The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside Middle School as 12-year-old Zara walked through the hallway with her backpack neatly positioned on her shoulders. Her grandmother had spent extra time that morning making sure every detail was perfect. The navy blue uniform was freshly pressed, her shoes were polished until they gleamed, and her hair was styled in neat braids that had taken her older sister almost an hour to complete the night before. Zara felt confident as she entered her 7th grade English classroom. She had always been a good student, the type who turned in assignments on time and participated in class discussions. Her parents had taught her to take pride in her appearance and to always present herself well. Today was no different, or so she thought. Mrs. Rodriguez was already at her desk, shuffling through papers with her usual stern expression. The woman had been teaching at Riverside for over 15 years and had a reputation for being strict but fair. At least that's what most people believed. Zara took her usual seat in the 3rd row, pulled out her notebook, and waited for class to begin. The classroom slowly filled with her classmates. There was Tyler, the class clown who always had a joke ready. Ashley sat near the window, already sketching in her art notebook. David, the quiet kid who was brilliant at math, was reviewing his homework one last time. These were kids Zara had known since elementary school, and she felt comfortable around them. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Rodriguez announced as the bell rang. "Before we start today's lesson, I need to address something that's been bothering me." Zara looked up from her notebook, curious about what the teacher might say. Maybe someone had forgotten their homework again, or perhaps there was an issue with the upcoming school play auditions. But then Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes landed directly on her. "Zara, please stand up," the teacher said in a tone that made the entire classroom go silent. Confused but obedient, Zara slowly rose from her seat. She could feel the eyes of her 23 classmates turning toward her. Her heart started beating a little faster, but she tried to stay calm. Maybe the teacher wanted to compliment her on yesterday's essay or ask her to help with something. "Look at yourself," Mrs. Rodriguez said, waving her hand in Zara's direction. "This is exactly what I'm talking about when I say some students come to school looking sloppy and unpresentable." The words hit Zara like a physical blow. She looked down at herself, trying to understand what the teacher meant. Her uniform was clean and properly fitted. Her shoes were tied correctly. Everything seemed fine to her. "But Mrs. Rodriguez, I don't understand," Zara said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My uniform follows all the school guidelines." "Don't talk back to me," the teacher snapped. "Your hair looks messy. Your attitude is careless, and the way you carry yourself shows a lack of respect for this classroom environment." Zara's hands instinctively went to her braids. They were the same style she wore every week. The same style her grandmother had taught her sister to do. The same style that had never been a problem before. She could feel her cheeks getting hot with embarrassment as her classmates continued to stare. Ashley turned in her seat to get a better look, confusion written across her face. Tyler, who usually couldn't sit still, was completely frozen in his chair. Even David looked up from his books, his mouth slightly open in surprise. None of them could understand what Mrs. Rodriguez was seeing that they weren't. "I work hard to maintain standards in this classroom," the teacher continued, now addressing the entire class while keeping her finger pointed at Zara. "When students come in here looking like they just rolled out of bed, it affects everyone's learning environment." Zara felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she fought them back. She had learned from her parents never to cry in public when facing unfair treatment. Instead, she tried once more to defend herself. "My grandmother helped me get ready this morning," she said, her voice slightly stronger now. "I've been wearing my uniform the same way all year, and I've never been told there was a problem." Mrs. Rodriguez's expression grew even more stern. "Are you questioning my judgment? This is exactly the kind of disrespectful attitude I'm talking about. Sit down and don't say another word." The command felt like a slap. Zara slowly lowered herself back into her seat, her face burning with shame and confusion. Around her, the classroom remained unnaturally quiet. Even Tyler, who could usually find humor in any situation, looked uncomfortable. For the rest of the 50-minute class period, Zara sat in her chair feeling like she was under a microscope. Every time Mrs. Rodriguez looked in her direction, she felt smaller and smaller. The teacher's words kept echoing in her mind. Sloppy, unpresentable, disrespectful. These were words that had never been used to describe her before. When the bell finally rang, Zara gathered her books quickly and headed for the door. She could hear some of her classmates whispering behind her, and she wasn't sure if they were talking about what had just happened or something else entirely. She didn't want to know. In the hallway, Ashley caught up with her. "Zara, wait up. That was totally unfair. You look fine to me. Actually, you always look really put together." "Thanks," Zara mumbled, not trusting herself to say more without her voice cracking. Tyler joined them at the lockers. "Yeah, that was weird. I've gotten in trouble for actually breaking dress code rules, but you weren't even close to breaking any rules. I don't get it." Their support meant something to Zara, but it also made her feel worse in a way. If her friends could see that she looked fine, then why couldn't her teacher? What was Mrs. Rodriguez really seeing when she looked at her? During lunch, Zara sat with her usual group but barely touched her food. The sandwich her grandmother had packed for her sat untouched in its brown paper bag. She kept replaying the morning's events, trying to figure out what she could have done differently. "You should tell your parents," suggested Ashley. "My mom would be furious if a teacher treated me like that for no reason." "Maybe it wasn't for no reason," Zara said quietly. "Maybe I really do look sloppy and I just can't see it." "Are you kidding me right now?" Tyler said, loudly enough that other kids at nearby tables turned to look. "You're literally one of the most put-together people in our grade. This morning you looked exactly like you always do, which is perfectly fine." David, who rarely spoke, up in group conversations, nodded in agreement. "The dress code handbook is pretty clear about what's acceptable. You weren't violating anything." But despite her friend's reassurance, Zara spent the rest of the school day second-guessing everything about herself. She checked her reflection in every mirror and window she passed. She adjusted her braids countless times. She made sure her uniform was smooth and her shoes were still clean. When the final bell rang, she walked to the pickup area where her older sister London was waiting in their mom's car. London was a senior in high school and had always been protective of her little sister. "How was school?" London asked as Zara climbed into the passenger seat. "Fine," Zara replied automatically, staring out the window. But London knew her sister well enough to recognize when something was wrong. As they drove home, she kept glancing over at Zara, noting the unusually quiet mood and the way her sister kept touching her hair. "Seriously, what happened today?" London pressed gently. Zara finally turned toward her sister, and London could see the hurt in her eyes. "Do I look sloppy to you?" The question caught London off guard. "What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that?" And then, slowly, the whole story came tumbling out. By the time they pulled into their driveway, London's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "She said what?" London asked, her voice dangerously low. "Maybe she was right, though," Zara said, though she didn't really believe it. "Maybe I need to try harder with how I look." London turned off the car and faced her sister directly. "Listen to me very carefully. There was absolutely nothing wrong with how you look today. There's never anything wrong with how you look. What happened to you today wasn't about your appearance or your attitude. It was wrong and it's not okay." As they walked toward the house, London was already making plans. This wasn't going to end with just a conversation at the dinner table. Some things required a bigger response, and she knew exactly who to call. The Williams family dinner table was usually filled with laughter and stories from everyone's day. Tonight felt different. Zara pushed her food around her plate, barely eating the chicken and rice that her grandmother had prepared with extra care. Her parents, Dr. Michael Williams and attorney Keisha Williams, exchanged concerned glances across the table. "Sweetheart, you've hardly touched your food," her grandmother said gently, reaching over to feel Zara's forehead. "Are you feeling sick?" Zara shook her head but didn't look up from her plate. London, who had been unusually quiet since they got home, cleared her throat and looked directly at her parents. "Mom, Dad, something happened at school today that you need to know about." Both parents immediately gave London their full attention. Dr. Williams set down his fork and Keisha leaned forward in her chair. They had raised their daughters to speak up when something was wrong, and they could tell this was serious. "What kind of something?" Keisha asked, her lawyer instincts already kicking in. London looked at her younger sister, silently asking for permission to share the story. Zara finally looked up and nodded slightly. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself forever, especially with how upset it had made her feel all day. "Tell them what Mrs. Rodriguez said to you in English class," London encouraged softly. Zara took a deep breath and began recounting the morning's events. As she spoke, she watched her parents' expressions change from concern to confusion to anger. Her father's jaw tightened when she described being called sloppy in front of the entire class. Her mother's eyes flashed when Zara mentioned how the teacher had pointed at her and used her as an example of what not to do. "She really said you looked like you rolled out of bed?" her grandmother asked, her voice rising with indignation. "Child, I ironed that uniform myself last night. Your hair was braided perfectly. There wasn't a thing wrong with how you looked." "That's what I kept thinking," Zara said, finally finding her voice. "I kept checking myself in mirrors all day trying to figure out what was wrong with me." "Nothing is wrong with you," Dr. Williams said firmly. "Absolutely nothing." Keisha had been quiet during most of Zara's story, but now she was asking the detailed questions that came naturally to her as an attorney. "Had this teacher ever made comments about your appearance before? What about your behavior in class? Have you been having any problems with assignments or participation?" "No, nothing like that," Zara replied. "I've always done well in her class. I turn in my homework on time. I participate in discussions. Yesterday she even said my essay about the civil rights movement was one of the best in the class." "So this came completely out of nowhere?" Keisha pressed. Zara thought about it for a moment. "Well, there have been a few times when I felt like she treated me differently than other kids. Like when Tyler comes in with his shirt untucked and his hair messy, she just tells him to fix it. But when I ask to go to the bathroom or sharpen my pencil, she acts like I'm being disruptive." London nodded. "I've heard some of the other black kids at school talking about Mrs. Rodriguez. Apparently she has a reputation." "What kind of reputation?" Dr. Williams asked. "The kind where she seems to have different standards for different students," London said carefully. "But nobody ever complains officially because she's been there forever and parents think it won't make a difference." The family sat in silence for a moment, processing this information. Finally, Keisha spoke up. "This isn't acceptable. We need to address this with the school administration first thing tomorrow morning." "What if that makes it worse for Zara?" Dr. Williams asked. "Sometimes when parents complain, teachers take it out on the students." "Then we document everything," Keisha replied. "I'm not letting this slide. No child should be humiliated like that, especially when they've done nothing wrong." After dinner, London went up to her room and immediately grabbed her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for: Uncle Jerome. Her father's younger brother was someone she had always been close to, partly because he was only 12 years older than she was, and partly because he had always treated her like an adult. But Uncle Jerome wasn't just any relative. He was General Jerome Williams of the United States Air Force, currently stationed at the Pentagon, and working on some of the military's most important education and training initiatives. London knew that if anyone would understand the seriousness of what had happened to Zara, it would be him. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar voice answered. "London, what a nice surprise. How's my favorite niece doing?" "I'm your only niece, Uncle Jerome," London said, managing a small smile, despite her anger. "But I'm not calling with good news." The tone of her voice immediately made him more serious. "What's wrong? Is everyone okay?" London told him everything, starting with how Zara had looked when she picked her up from school, and ending with the dinner conversation that had just finished downstairs. As she spoke, she could hear her uncle's breathing getting heavier on the other end of the line. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said when she finished. "A teacher singled out my niece in front of her entire class, called her sloppy and unpresentable, and did this despite the fact that Zara was following all dress code policies and has never had behavioral issues?" "That's exactly what happened," London confirmed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. London could almost hear her uncle thinking, "London, I need you to do something for me. I want you to write down everything Zara told you, with As much detail as possible. Include the exact words the teacher used, the time of day it happened, and the names of any students who witnessed it. Can you do that? Of course, but why? Because what happened to Zara isn't just wrong, it's potentially illegal. Schools that receive federal funding, which includes pretty much every public school in the country, are required to provide equal treatment to all students regardless of race. What you're describing sounds like it could be a civil rights violation. London felt a chill run down her spine. She had been angry about what happened to her sister, but she hadn't thought about it in legal terms. There's something else you should know, Uncle Jerome continued. I'm currently working with the Department of Education on a federal initiative to address exactly these kinds of issues in schools. We've been seeing more and more reports of discriminatory treatment, and we're taking it very seriously. What does that mean for Zara? It means that this isn't going to be handled just at the local school level. I'm going to make some phone calls tonight. There are people in Washington who need to know about this. London felt a mixture of relief and nervousness. She had hoped her uncle would take this seriously, but she hadn't expected such a strong response. Should I tell Mom and Dad about this conversation? Not yet, Uncle Jerome said. Let me do some groundwork first. But London, I want you to know that you did the right thing by calling me. Zara is lucky to have a big sister who looks out for her like this. After they hung up, London sat on her bed staring at her phone. She had expected her uncle to be sympathetic and maybe offer some advice about dealing with the school. She hadn't expected him to start talking about federal investigations and civil rights violations. Downstairs, she could hear her parents still discussing the situation with their grandmother. Their voices were getting louder as they became more upset about what had happened. London knew that by tomorrow morning her family would be ready to march into that school and demand answers. What they didn't know yet was that help was already on the way from a much higher level than they could have imagined. Uncle Jerome wasn't just any concerned relative. He was someone with the power and connections to make sure that what happened to Zara would have consequences that reached far beyond one classroom in one school. As London finally started working, on the detailed account her uncle had requested, she had no idea that 3 time zones away, General Jerome Williams was already making phone calls that would change everything. The wheels of justice were starting to turn, and they were going to move faster than anyone expected. 3 hours after London's phone call ended, General Jerome Williams was still awake in his Pentagon office, surrounded by files and making calls that most people could never imagine making. The building was nearly empty at this late hour, but Jerome's office lights blazed as he worked through his contact list with the focus of a man on a mission. His first call had been to his longtime friend Patricia Chen, who worked as a senior investigator in the Department of Education's office for civil rights. Patricia had been fighting discrimination in schools for over 20 years, and Jerome knew that if anyone would understand the urgency of Zara's situation, it would be her. Jerome, it's almost midnight, Patricia had said when she answered the phone. This better be important. It is, Jerome had replied, and then he told her everything London had shared with him. Patricia's response had been immediate and decisive. We need to move on this quickly. If what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't an isolated incident. Teachers don't usually start with such blatant discrimination overnight. There's probably a pattern we haven't caught yet. That's exactly what I was thinking, Jerome said. Can you open an investigation? I'm opening a preliminary inquiry as we speak, Patricia replied, and Jerome could hear her typing on her computer in the background. I'll have a team review the school's disciplinary records first thing tomorrow morning. We'll be looking for patterns of disparate treatment based on race. But Jerome wasn't stopping with just one call. His next conversation was with Dr. Robert Harrison, a colleague who specialized in military education programs and had extensive connections throughout the public school system. Dr. Harrison had been working on initiatives to improve educational opportunities for military families, and he understood better than most how discrimination could impact a child's entire future. The thing that makes me angriest, Jerome told Dr. Harrison, is that this little girl went to school proud of how she looked, confident in herself, and one teacher's prejudice made her question everything about who she is. I've seen it too many times, Dr. Harrison replied grimly. And you're right to escalate this. These situations rarely get better on their own. They usually get worse until someone with authority steps in. Dr. Harrison promised to reach out to his contacts in the state education department to ensure that the federal investigation would have full cooperation at every level. He also offered to review any documentation that might be needed to build a comprehensive case. Jerome's third call was perhaps the most important one. He contacted Commander Lisa Thompson, who ran a special task force focused on protecting the rights of military families in civilian schools. Many service members' children attended public schools near military bases, and there had been growing concerns about discrimination against these students. General Williams, Commander Thompson said, "I've actually been tracking some concerning trends in schools near military installations. We've had several complaints about teachers who seem to have particular biases against children from military families, especially children of color." "Are you saying this might be bigger than just one incident with one teacher?" Jerome asked. "I'm saying that Riverside Middle School has been on our radar for 6 months. We've had 3 informal complaints about staff members there, but none of the families wanted to file official reports. They were afraid of retaliation against their children." This information hit Jerome like a physical blow. The thought that other children had been suffering in silence while he was unaware made him even more determined to take action. His niece's experience wasn't unique, which meant the problem was systemic and needed a systematic response. "Commander, I want to coordinate our response. This isn't just about protecting Zara anymore. This is about protecting every child who walks into that school." While Jerome was making his calls in Washington, London was at home completing the detailed report her uncle had requested. She had interviewed Zara again, this time asking specific questions about every aspect of what had happened. She also reached out to some of Zara's classmates through social media, carefully asking if they had witnessed what happened without revealing why she was asking. The responses she got were eye-opening. Ashley confirmed every detail of Zara's story and added that she had felt uncomfortable watching it happen. Tyler said he had wanted to speak up during class but was afraid of getting in trouble himself. David mentioned that he had noticed Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to treat black students differently, but he had never seen anything as obvious as what happened to Zara. Most importantly, London discovered that Zara wasn't the only student who had been targeted. A girl named Destiny, who was in Zara's third-period science class, had been called disruptive and attitude-prone by Mrs. Rodriguez just last week, despite having no history of behavioral problems. Another student, Cameron, had been sent to the principal's office twice for defiance when he asked clarifying questions about assignments. London compiled all of this information into a comprehensive report that she emailed to her uncle at 2 a.m. She included names, dates, specific quotes, and even some screenshots of social media conversations where other students had discussed feeling uncomfortable in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom. By 6 a.m., Jerome had forwarded London's report to Patricia Chen, Dr. Harrison, and Commander Thompson. The response was swift and coordinated. Patricia's team began pulling the school's disciplinary records for the past 3 years, looking specifically for patterns in how different students were treated. Dr. Harrison contacted the state superintendent's office to ensure they were aware that a federal investigation was beginning. Commander Thompson prepared a team to interview military families whose children attended Riverside Middle School. But Jerome was also working on a more immediate response. He had spent years learning that sometimes the most effective way to create change was to make sure the right people understood that the situation was being watched at the highest levels. He began making arrangements for a personal visit to the school, but not the kind of quiet meeting that administrators could easily dismiss or cover up. At 7 a.m., Jerome called the Pentagon's transportation office and requested an official aircraft for a priority mission. When asked about the nature of the mission, he simply said it was related to ensuring compliance with federal education standards for military families. The transportation officer who had worked with Jerome for several years didn't ask follow-up questions. General Williams had a reputation for thoroughness and fairness, and if he said something was a priority, it was treated as such. By 8 a.m., Jerome had a flight scheduled for the following morning. The aircraft would land at the small airfield adjacent to Riverside Middle School. which was often used for emergency services and occasional military training exercises. The timing would ensure that students and staff would be in their first period classes when the plane arrived. Jerome's final call of the morning was to Principal Johnson at Riverside Middle School. He identified himself simply as a representative of the Department of Defense and requested an immediate meeting to discuss concerns about the treatment of military dependents at your school. Principal Johnson, who had been hoping to have a quiet Tuesday morning, suddenly found herself scrambling to understand what kind of federal attention her school had attracted. She had no idea that the concern stemmed from one teacher's treatment of one student, or that the representative she would be meeting with was the uncle of the child, who had been humiliated just 24 hours earlier. As Jerome finally headed home to get a few hours of sleep before his flight, he thought about Zara and how confused and hurt she must have felt sitting in that classroom. He thought about all the other children who had suffered similar treatment in silence. And he thought about how sometimes it took someone with authority and resources to step in and make sure that justice wasn't just an idea in a textbook, but a reality that protected every child who deserved to learn in an environment free from discrimination. The investigation was officially beginning, but Jerome knew that real change would only come when everyone involved understood that there would be serious consequences for treating any child as less worthy of respect and dignity than any other. The morning air at Riverside Middle School felt different somehow, though none of the students walking through the hallways could have explained why. Zara walked slowly toward her first period math class, her stomach churning with anxiety about facing another day at school. She had barely slept the night before, replaying yesterday's humiliation over and over in her mind. Her parents had assured her at breakfast that they would be meeting with Principal Johnson later that morning, but Zara wasn't sure that would make things better. Sometimes when parents complained about teachers, it just made the teachers angrier at the students. She was terrified that Mrs. Rodriguez would find a way to make her life even more miserable. London had driven her to school again, giving her an extra long hug before she got out of the car. "Remember what I told you," London had whispered in her ear. "You are perfect exactly as you are. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Now, sitting in Mrs. Patterson's math class, Zara tried to focus on the algebra problems on the board, but her mind kept wandering. Through the classroom windows, she could see the clear blue sky that stretched toward the small airfield behind the school. That airfield was mostly used for emergency helicopters and the occasional small plane, but it had been quiet for months. Mrs. Patterson was in the middle of explaining how to solve for X when a low rumbling sound began to fill the air. At first, it was so faint that only a few students noticed. Tyler, who sat near the windows, looked up from his worksheet with a puzzled expression. "Do you guys hear that?" he whispered to the students around him. The rumbling grew louder, deeper, and more powerful. It wasn't the sound of a car or truck passing by the school. This was something much bigger, something that seemed to be coming from above. Mrs. Patterson stopped talking and looked toward the windows, her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What in the world?" she muttered, walking over to peer outside. The sound was getting louder by the second, and now every student in the classroom was looking up at the ceiling or toward the windows. Zara felt her heart start to race, but not from fear. Something about that sound seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have heard it before. Suddenly, Ashley pointed toward the window and shouted, "Look, there's a plane!" Everyone rushed to the windows, and there it was, a large military aircraft circling low over the school. It wasn't like the small private planes that occasionally used the nearby airfield. This was clearly a military transport jet, painted in official government colors and bearing the distinctive markings of the United States Air Force. The plane made one slow, deliberate circle over the entire school campus before heading toward the airfield for landing. Students in every classroom were now pressed against windows, watching in amazement as the aircraft touched down with a precision that spoke of highly trained pilots. Mrs. Patterson looked as confused as her students. "I have no idea what this is about," she said, reaching for the phone on her desk to call the main office. But before she could dial, the school's PA system crackled to life. "Attention all students and staff. came Principal Johnson's voice, though she sounded more nervous than usual. "We are implementing a temporary lockdown as a precautionary measure while we address an official visit to our campus. Please remain in your classrooms until further notice. This is not a drill, but there is no danger to anyone in the building." The students looked at each other with wide eyes. A lockdown because of an official visit? That didn't happen for normal school board meetings or state inspections. Tyler voiced what everyone was thinking. Who exactly is visiting us? Through the classroom windows, they could see the military aircraft had come to a complete stop on the airfield. The engines were winding down, but everyone was too far away to see if anyone had gotten off the plane yet. In the main office, Principal Johnson was frantically trying to understand what was happening. 20 minutes earlier, she had received a phone call informing her that a Department of Defense representative would be arriving for the scheduled meeting, but nobody had mentioned anything about a military aircraft or the kind of official visit that required security protocols. Her secretary, Mrs. Torres, was fielding phone calls from confused teachers and trying to manage the growing chaos. "Principal Johnson, Mrs. Rodriguez is here asking what's going on. She says her students are all talking about the plane and she can't get them to focus on their lesson." Principal Johnson felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something told her that Mrs. Rodriguez's presence in the office right now was not a coincidence. Meanwhile, across the campus in the administrative building, several black SUVs had quietly pulled into the parking lot. Men and women in professional suits were getting out of the vehicles carrying briefcases and official-looking folders. These weren't local education officials or state inspectors. These people had the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Back in the math classroom, Zara was staring out the window with a strange feeling growing in her chest. The sight of that military plane had triggered a memory from last summer, when she and London had visited Uncle Jerome at his base. She remembered the sounds, the official protocols, the way everything became very serious very quickly when military business was being conducted. "Mrs. Patterson," Zara said quietly, raising her hand, "I think I might know what this is about." Before Mrs. Patterson could respond, the classroom door opened and Mr. Chen, the assistant principal, stuck his head inside. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to speak with you in the hallway for just a moment." The teacher stepped outside, and through the small window in the door, students could see her having an intense conversation with Mr. Chen. When she came back into the room, her expression had changed completely. "Zara," she said gently, "you need to gather your things and come with me to the main office." The other students turned to stare at Zara with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Ashley reached over and squeezed her friend's hand. "Are you in trouble?" she whispered. "I don't think so," Zara replied, though her heart was pounding as she packed up her backpack. As she walked through the hallways toward the main office, Zara passed several classrooms where students were still pressed against windows, trying to get a better view of what was happening outside. Teachers were struggling to maintain order while dealing with their own curiosity about the unprecedented situation. When Zara reached the main office, she was surprised to see her parents already there, looking both concerned and determined. Her mother stood up immediately when she saw her daughter. "Sweetheart, are you okay?" Keisha asked, pulling Zara into a hug. "I'm fine, Mom, but what's going on? Why is there a military plane at our school?" Before her parents could answer, the main office doors opened again and Zara's breath caught in her throat. Walking through the door, wearing his full military dress uniform with rows of ribbons and insignia that spoke of years of dedicated service, was Uncle Jerome. He looked exactly like Zara remembered from their summer visit, but somehow more imposing in this setting. His presence seemed to fill the entire room, and everyone, including Principal Johnson, stood a little straighter when he entered. "Uncle Jerome?" Zara said in amazement. "What are you doing here?" He smiled at his niece, the stern expression on his face softening for just a moment. "I'm here to make sure that every student in this school is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve," he said, "including you." Principal Johnson stepped forward, clearly trying to regain control of the situation in her own building. "General Williams, I wasn't expecting such a formal arrival. When you called yesterday, I thought we would be having a simple meeting in my office." Uncle Jerome's expression became serious again as he looked directly at the principal. Mrs. Johnson, what happened to my niece yesterday wasn't a simple matter that could be resolved with a simple meeting. When a child is discriminated against in a public school, it becomes a federal matter. And federal matters require federal responses. The room fell completely silent. Everyone present could feel the weight of his words and understand that this wasn't just an upset uncle visiting his niece's school. This was an official investigation being conducted at the highest levels of government, and it was just getting started. Principal Johnson's office had never felt so small. What was usually a space where she held comfortable meetings with parents and teachers now felt like a courtroom, with Uncle Jerome sitting across from her desk in his military uniform, flanked by 3 federal education officials who had introduced themselves with titles that made her head spin. Patricia Chen, the lead investigator from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, opened a thick folder and placed it on the desk. Mrs. Johnson, we've spent the last 18 hours reviewing your school's disciplinary records, and what we've found is deeply concerning. Zara sat between her parents, still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Yesterday she had been a confused 12-year-old wondering what she had done wrong. Today she was sitting in the middle of what felt like the most important meeting in her school's history. I don't understand, Principal Johnson said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. We follow all federal guidelines. We have diversity training every year. Dr. Harrison, the education specialist who had flown in with Uncle Jerome, pulled out a chart that made everyone in the room lean forward. Let's look at the numbers. In the past 3 years, African American students at Riverside Middle School have been suspended at a rate 3 times higher than white students. They've been referred to the principal's office for disrespectful behavior at a rate 4 times higher than their white classmates. But those are just statistics, Principal Johnson protested. They don't tell the whole story. Actually, they tell exactly the story we need to understand, Patricia replied. And when we dig deeper into the individual cases, the pattern becomes even clearer. African American students are being punished for behaviors that, when exhibited by white students, are either ignored or handled with warnings. Uncle Jerome had been quietly listening to the presentation, but now he spoke up. Mrs. Johnson, yesterday my niece was humiliated in front of her entire class by Mrs. Rodriguez. She was called sloppy and unpresentable despite following every dress code rule. Can you explain to me how that aligns with providing equal educational opportunities? Principal Johnson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I haven't had a chance to speak with Mrs. Rodriguez about the incident yet. I was planning to investigate once I received your call. That's interesting, said Commander Thompson, who had been reviewing personnel files on her tablet. Because according to our records, this is the 4th complaint about Mrs. Rodriguez's treatment of black students in the past 2 years. Each time the complaint was filed away with no follow-up investigation. The room fell silent except for the sound of papers being shuffled. Zara watched her principal's face grow paler with each revelation. She had always thought of Principal Johnson as someone who was fair and reasonable, but now she was learning that fairness meant more than just treating all students the same when they were standing right in front of you. Where is Mrs. Rodriguez now? Uncle Jerome asked. She's teaching her second period class, Principal Johnson replied weakly. Patricia Chen looked at her watch. We'll need to speak with her immediately, and we'll need to review security footage from yesterday's incident. Security footage? Principal Johnson asked. All classrooms in this building have security cameras, correct? Dr. Harrison said. We'll need to see the footage from Mrs. Rodriguez's first period English class. Yesterday morning, Principal Johnson nodded reluctantly and reached for her phone to call the security office. While she made the call, Uncle Jerome turned to his niece. Zara, I want you to know that what happened to you yesterday was wrong, and it's never going to happen again. Not to you and not to any other student in this school. But what if the other kids think I'm in trouble because of all this? Zara asked quietly. Her mother squeezed her hand. Sweetheart, you're not in trouble. You're helping to make sure that no other child has to go through what you experienced. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Rodriguez walked into the principal's office, looking confused and slightly annoyed at being pulled out of her class. When she saw the room full of official-looking people, her expression changed to one of concern. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Principal Johnson said, "these are representatives from the Department of Education and the Department of Defense. They're here to discuss the incident that occurred in your classroom yesterday morning." Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes immediately found Zara sitting with her parents, and for just a moment her face showed a flash of recognition and something that might have been guilt. "I'm not sure what incident you're referring to," Mrs. Rodriguez said, but her voice lacked conviction. Patricia Chen opened her folder again. "Yesterday morning at approximately 8:15 a.m. you called student Zara Williams to the front of your classroom and used her as an example of inappropriate dress and behavior. Is that correct?" "I may have corrected a student's appearance, but that's part of my job as an educator," Mrs. Rodriguez replied, though she was now avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Uncle Jerome said calmly, "I want you to look at my niece and tell me what about her appearance yesterday was inappropriate." Mrs. Rodriguez glanced at Zara briefly, then looked away. "Students need to understand that there are standards." "What standards?" Uncle Jerome pressed. Her uniform was pressed and clean. Her hair was neatly braided. Her shoes were polished. "What exactly did you see that was inappropriate?" The teacher opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Everyone in the room could see that she had no real answer. Dr. Harrison pulled out his tablet and showed it to Mrs. Rodriguez. "We've reviewed security footage from your classroom yesterday. We can see clearly that Zara's appearance met all school dress code requirements. We can also hear every word you said to her." Mrs. Rodriguez's face went completely white. I was having a difficult morning. Sometimes when you're stressed, you don't make the best decisions." "This isn't about one bad morning," Patricia said firmly. "We've identified a pattern of discriminatory behavior in your classroom spanning multiple years. This ends now." Principal Johnson finally found her voice. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you're suspended immediately pending a full investigation. You'll need to clear out your classroom today." The teacher looked around the room as if searching for someone who might defend her, but found only stern faces and disappointed expressions. Without another word, she gathered her things and left the office. After Mrs. Rodriguez was gone, the federal officials spent another hour outlining the changes that would be implemented at Riverside Middle School. There would be mandatory bias training for all staff, new policies for handling discrimination complaints, and regular monitoring by federal oversight teams. But the most important change came when Principal Johnson turned to Zara directly. "Zara, I want to apologize to you personally. What happened in that classroom should never have occurred, and I take full responsibility for not addressing the warning signs we should have seen earlier." Zara looked up at the principal, then at her uncle, then at her parents. "I just want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Uncle Jerome smiled proudly at his niece. "And because you were brave enough to tell your family what happened, it won't. You've helped create change that will protect students for years to come." 3 months later, Zara was back in the same classroom, but everything felt different. Her new English teacher, Mr. Foster, treated every student with respect and fairness. The school had implemented peer support programs and anonymous reporting systems that made students feel safer, speaking up about unfair treatment. Zara had also become something of a local hero. When news of the federal investigation spread, other families began sharing their own stories of discrimination. A support group was formed for students who had experienced similar treatment, and Zara found herself helping younger kids understand that their worth wasn't determined by how others chose to see them. The story made national news, with headlines about how one family's refusal to accept discrimination had led to systemic change in their school district. Uncle Jerome used his platform to speak about the importance of standing up for what's right, regardless of how difficult it might seem, but perhaps the most meaningful change was in Zara herself. She walked through the halls of Riverside Middle School with her head held high, knowing that she had not only survived an unfair situation, but had helped make the world a little more just for everyone who came after her. On the anniversary of that difficult day, Zara received a letter from a 6th grade student named Amelia, whose family had just moved to the area. "Thank you for making our school a place where I don't have to worry about being treated differently because of who I am," the letter read. You showed me that even kids can change the world when they refuse to accept unfairness. And in that moment, Zara understood that sometimes the most important victories come not from avoiding difficult situations, but from facing them with courage and the support of people who believe in doing what's right.